When the RX 6800 launched, it had a $579 MSRP. When the RTX 3070 launched, it had a $499.99 MSRP. And so given those plus the Nvidia feature advantages, honestly, the RX 6800, again, I'm talking the non-XT version here, got kind of trounced in reviews. Who was it for? Spend a little more on the XT version or buy a 3070 for cheaper. However, we're now in 2023 and the actual pricing on the real market has changed considerably. So with now the RX 6800 actually costing significantly less money than an RTX 3070, this is going to be pretty interesting to update this review in the latest games, including Unreal Engine 5. We'll look at ray tracing performance. We'll look at FSR2 versus DLSS. Both technologies have gotten much better since launch. In fact, the RX 6800, AMD didn't even have FSR 1.0, let alone 2.0 when these things came out. You can see my test system specs below. I have everything at the out-of-the-box settings, although it does have ResizeBAR and Smart Access Memory enabled by default on the AM5 platform. If you're looking at temperatures, the cooler models here are the Power Color Red Dragon on the AMD GPU, and we have the Asus Dual on the 3070. I did the cheapest model available when I purchased them, although they're not necessarily the cheapest today. Let's jump into the benchmarks, and then we'll get some final thoughts on which one you should actually buy if you're buying right now at the end of the video. Let's start our testing in Unreal Engine 5.1 because that's what so many new AAA games have announced they will be using. And if it's anything like Unreal Engine 4, that's true. Tons of games out in Unreal Engine. Unreal Engine 5.1 comes with new features like the Lumen lighting system, which is a software-based ray tracing system, which can be hardware accelerated. We currently have that off, although we'll test that out next. And then it also has features like virtual shadow maps, nanite, all sorts of revolutionary technology. And right now, the only game we can test it in is Fortnite, because Fortnite is developed by Epic, who is the developer who makes Unreal Engine. So that explains why we're testing Fortnite and why we're not testing it at lower, more competitive settings, because really I'm just using Fortnite as a stand-in for Unreal Engine 5. Now, we're also not maxing it out here. This is 1440p at the high preset, using DX12 so you get all of the lumen and all nanite and all of that. Here we're seeing the 3070 running about 66 FPS average, and the 6800 running at 81 FPS average, the 6800 with a 22% lead. The middle frame rate counter is the average. The one on the left is the current frame rate, and the one on the right is the 1% lows. But how about that ray tracing? So if we turn on hardware accelerated ray tracing, that's what I mean by HWRT on, we're still seeing this at the high setting rather than the Epic. And now we see the 6800 dropping to an 11% lead over the 3070, and both GPUs are running slower than they were before. By enabling the hardware accelerated ray tracing, it's making the Lumen lighting system a bit more accurate, but does take a bit of a performance penalty, although it's not one of the more demanding ray tracing implementations we've seen. In this case, we still see the 3070 averaging over 60 FPS, and the 6800 averaging over 70 FPS, although the 6800 has 1% lows at about 59 versus 49 on the 3070, and the 6800 overall has a bit of a smoother frame time graph, which is nice to see. And you should be judging the smoothness in this video from the frame time graph rather than how the footage looks due to 60 FPS capture versus variable refresh rate gameplay. Anyway, if we look at this, we're now looking at the game completely maxed out at 1440p. I wanted to show you first that these GPUs absolutely can play Unreal Engine 5 at good, high settings with and without ray tracing enabled. But if we go up to the Epic settings and kick on hardware accelerated ray tracing, both GPUs are struggling here. The 6800 is still 5% ahead, and again, this does have the hardware accelerated ray tracing. But they're both averaging around 40. The 3070 is averaging exactly 40, and the 6800 42 FPS, so huge win here. In this video, I'm going to call a 5% lead about a tie. I don't think you would notice it. Although the 1% lows are 34 versus 31, so a bit more noticeable of a lead there, but not by a whole heck of a lot. So neither GPU is able to completely max out the game at native 1440p. Now, if we enable upscaling technologies, we are able to get pretty close to a 60 FPS average. What we're looking at here is the same 1440p EPIC settings with hardware accelerated ray tracing, but now we're upscaling at the quality settings, so a 66% in internal resolution, and upscaling using DLSS on the Nvidia GPU, because I think that's what people would actually do, and using TSR, because this game doesn't feature FSR2 at this point in time. Now, it is compatible with Unreal Engine 5, so I'm sure it'll get updated in most Unreal Engine games, but TSR is kind of the Unreal Engine version of a temporal super resolution. Here we're seeing the 6800 averaging about 60 and the 3070 averaging about 57 with a 5% lead for the 6800. I do think DLSS looks better than TSR though, in motion, especially on the character's arms and things like that. Just looks a little bit more stable with DLSS. Now let's drop down to some 1080p, because I know you could be buying these GPUs for 1440p, but you could also be buying these GPUs for 1080p at higher settings or higher refresh rates. But even at 1080p, if you want to completely max it out, Unreal Engine 5 is very demanding. 1080p EPIC settings with hardware accelerated ray tracing on. We're seeing the 3070 averaging in the 54 FPS range, with the 6800 around 58. And that's a 7% lead for the 6800. So not a huge lead here, maybe a little bit noticeable, especially the 1% lows. We're seeing the 1% lows, which again is the far right side on those frame FPS counters, as 48 versus 40. So a much more noticeable lead on the 1% lows versus on the averages. And 1% lows are, I would argue, the most important thing, because that's the the thing you notice the most in your frame rate is how low it gets at times. Now, let's reduce settings a little bit. Let's try turning the ray tracing off. So 1080p EPIC settings without the hardware accelerated ray tracing, still has Lumen's software-based ray trace lighting, which still looks very good. Now we're seeing the 6800 with a 19% lead over the 3070. And the 6800 is averaging 68 FPS with 1% lows around 55, whereas the 3070 is averaging just a little under 60 FPS, about 58 to 57 with 1% lows around 44. So as long as you turn off the hardware accelerated ray tracing, the 6800 is able to offer a very good 1080p EPIC settings experience here. Not super high refresh rate, but over around 70 FPS much of the time. Now, if we drop settings a bit for a high refresh rate 1080p experience, and just go down to high settings to do that. By the way, if you go down below high settings on the presets, it turns off Lumen and Nanite and virtual shadow maps, which is the entire point of what we're testing here. So I understand to play Fortnite competitively, you would turn settings down further, but here at the 1080p high settings, which still has Lumen and Nanite and virtual shadow maps, but with the hardware RT off, we're seeing the 6800 with a 26% lead, averaging 111 FPS versus 89 FPS on the 3070, 1% lows on the 6800 with 92 versus 66 on the 3070. So once again, seeing an even larger performance lead on the 1% lows than we're seeing on the overall averages. Now, because there's so much performance headroom here, I think it would make sense for a lot of people to turn on the hardware RT to get that more accurate lighting. And with that enabled, the lead for the 6800 does drop to a 10% lead, but that is still, a somewhat noticeable lead. And we're seeing the 6800 with around a 93 FPS average versus 86 on the 3070. The 3070's 1% lows are right around 59 to 60, whereas the 6800 is around 77. So again, a more noticeable lead and smoother frame time graph when you're looking at those 1% lows versus the overall averages of the two GPUs. So a very good showing in Unreal Engine 5, but how about we look at ray tracing more in depth? Because we saw the 6800 still having a lead even when enabling hardware accelerated ray tracing in Unreal Engine 5 with its Lumen system. However, what we're going to look at here with Cyberpunk is as you increase the ray tracing demand, the AMD GPU falls off more considerably from its baseline performance lead. First, we're going to start out with ray tracing low, and here we see more similar to what we had in Unreal Engine 5 with Lumen, a light ray tracing workload. The ray tracing low setting in Cyberpunk is just local shadows. It doesn't have sun shadows, it doesn't have any bounce lighting, it doesn't have reflections. But here we see the 6800 with a 3% lead, and at 1080p, both GPUs are still getting a high refresh rate experience. You might actually use this. 91 FPS on the 6800 versus around 88 to 89 on the 3070, and we're not seeing a big difference in the 1% lows in this game, like we did in Fortnite. Now, when you turn the ray tracing settings to something a little more meaningful in this game, like the ray traced reflections, now we're actually seeing the 3070 with a 16% performance lead. By the way, there's no preset that enables just RT reflections, but that's what I'm doing here. I took the Ultra preset, which does not include ray tracing, and I turned on ray traced reflections individually. Also, please note if you're using these presets that the game will automatically enable image upscaling using FSR and or DLSS, or DLSS, not and, depending on your GPU. When you enable these presets, I'm manually turning it off to see the native 1080p performance. So do make that note. And also, it can be difficult to make Cyberpunk apply settings correctly. Sometimes people say, my performance numbers aren't quite matching yours. So to be clear, I've turned off upscaling, so this is native. The 6800 is able to play 1080p Ultra plus RT reflections at about 60 FPS, but the 3070 is getting about 71 FPS here. So definitely a noticeable lead there with the 16% lead on the 3070. Now, the game does offer a ray tracing medium preset, which has similar but slightly more demanding, actually definitely more demanding performance hit than just enabling the RT reflections. So that's one reason I wanted to show the RT reflections. It's a meaningful difference to the image quality with the reflections in this game. Whereas if you go to the RT medium preset, that both GPUs get hit a lot harder on the overall frame rate, with the 3070 kind of in the mid 50s, the 6800 down in the mid to upper 40s. An 18% lead for the RTX 3070. Ray tracing medium does not have the ray traced reflections, although it does have the lighting set to the medium setting. It has the local shadows and the sun shadows. Now, some people would prefer getting that lighting in there versus the reflections. Some people would prefer the reflections. The lighting's a bit more subtle, but I think can at times actually have a bigger impact to the image quality, whereas the reflections are much more noticeable in a head-to-head on versus off comparison. So interesting. Now, if we go to 1080p Ray Tracing Ultra preset, we're now seeing a 31% lead for the RTX 3070 over the 6800. Now, the Ray Tracing Ultra preset keeps it keeps the ray traced local shadows, also the ray traced sun shadows. It does add in the reflections, and it has the ray traced bounce lighting at the Ultra setting, although it doesn't push it to the Psycho setting. This game is apparently coming out with an RT overdrive mode with full path tracing, although that's not released yet to the public. Anyway, the 6800 is able to average in the mid-30s, although the 1% lows drop below 30. The 3070 is only averaging in the mid-40s, so I think most people would choose not to run these settings on these GPUs because you saw that you could get a high refresh rate experience if you're just going to turn down the ray tracing a little bit. Now, you could also look into using image upscaling, especially with DLSS at 1080p not looking too terrible. But I'm going to look at more of the upscaled results at 1440p, because I do think these GPUs are, for a lot of people, going to be 1440p GPUs. So let's look at 1440p as well, which will make this a long video, but let's do it. 1440p ray tracing at the low setting. I did want to show this one without upscaling because this is the only ray tracing setting where they can get close enough to a 60 FPS average, where I feel like on a variable refresh rate screen, you might go with these settings. Now, we're seeing the 6800 with a 7% lead over the 3070. Also a bit more meaningful difference in the 1% lows. And it's possible, but I can't prove it, that this could actually be a bit of a VRAM issue on the 3070, pushing up against its 8 gigabytes of VRAM, affecting its 1% lows here and the smoothness of its frame time graph. we're seeing the 6800 averaging about 61, although definitely getting below that with a 1% low at 49. 3070 averaging about 58 with 39 FPS on the 1% lows. Now, if we want to turn on the RT reflections at 1440p, I think both GPUs drop to a frame rate where, while you could consider using it, it's not unplayable. I think it's a pretty terrible performance hit to take unless you're willing to use upscaling. So that's what we're looking at on the right-hand side of the screen. On the left-hand side of the screen, we see the native 1440p resolution, with the 3070 having a 12% lead, but only averaging around in the mid-40s, with the 6800 averaging in the lower 40s, both of them with 1% lows around 30, although the 6800 might have a 1 FPS lead there, not a huge difference. But when we enable the upscaling technologies with DLSS2 and FSR2 at the quality setting, the 3070 now has an 18% lead and is getting in the mid-70 FPS range. And the 6800 is over 60 FPS average and no longer has a lead in the 1% lows. Anyway, interesting stuff. Depends on if you're willing to hurt your image quality a little bit by upscaling in order to improve your image quality a bit with the ray tracing. It's kind of there's pros and cons, and I could see people going either way on that. Now, I will mention I do think the image quality from DLSS2 is still a little bit better than FSR2 quality, although it's not a massive lead. And there are certain scenes in this game where I actually think the ghosting is better on FSR2 than it is on DLSS. Now here we're looking at the ray tracing medium, which again has the local shadows, sun shadows, and medium lighting setting, none of the reflections. And again, this is very demanding. The 3070 is only getting in the mid-30s. The 6800 is only averaging right around 30. The 3070 has a 16% lead. If you enable the upscaling, even the 3070 is not able to hold a 60 FPS average, although it's pretty playable around a 52 FPS average, and the 6800 at a 46 FPS average. Personally, I feel like with the image quality hit from upscaling, if you look at the palm tree branches and things like that, plus still being at a pretty low frame rate, I think this is just too much ray tracing for these GPUs, in my opinion. And even more so when we go to the Ray Tracing Ultra preset. If you look at the native resolution, the RTX 3070 is winning in a murder-suicide, where it is winning by 32%. It's a very big lead over the 6800, but it's a meaningless lead at the native resolution because the 3070 is averaging well below 30 FPS, and its 1% lows around 20. The 6800 is averaging a little bit over 20 and has 1% lows in the teens. They're both doing terribly. With DLSS and FSR2 quality, the 3070's lead drops to 23%, and the 3070 can average a little under 50 FPS with around 48, 49, and the 6800 is averaging a little under 40 FPS with around 39. Again, I feel like it's just too much ray tracing for either of these GPUs, although the 3070 certainly has the larger lead the more you crank the ray tracing settings. So now let's look at what if we just tested Cyberpunk without ray tracing enabled. At 1440p Ultra, the 3070, the 6800 has a 16% lead, and at 1440p high settings, the 6800 has an 18% lead. And that's what you're seeing on the left is the Ultra. On the right, you're seeing the high settings. And I also think it's interesting that if you look at the two middle screens here, you see the 6800 at Ultra settings versus the 3070 at high settings. And the 6800 is actually faster at the Ultra settings than the 3070 is, even dropping down to the high settings. So that is a noticeable performance lead here. Although, the 3070 is able to play the game at 67-ish average FPS, at ultra settings, although the 1% lows do drop below 60. And the 6800 can keep the 1% lows above 60 even at the ultra settings at 1440p. So a fairly meaningful win there for the 6800. Now, if we want to test this game out at 1080p, at 1080p Ultra, both of them are getting such a high frame rate that you can't even start running into CPU limits and things like that, meaning they basically tied. I did see the 3070 with about a 3% lead, although both of them are over, they're in the 100 and something, 100 mid 110 range, even pushing up to almost 120 at times. So, not a meaningful difference there in the non-ray trace performance. So I thought, interestingly, since they had some headroom for ray tracing, let's compare it versus the RT reflections enabled, where the 3070 had a 16% lead, the 6800 could get about 60 FPS, and the 3070 get about 72 FPS. And then you can compare, we're just playing at Ultra versus enabling the RT reflections. The 3070 is 68% faster than itself when you have RT off, and the 6800 is 90% faster than itself when you have RT off. So again, you have to ask yourself, are those nicer reflections worth that performance hit, even when you can get a playable frame rate using the ray tracing? Anyway, since we just spent so long looking at ray tracing, where we all know Nvidia has its big advantage, how about we now look at a game where AMD has a large advantage, and that is Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, and also, by extension, Warzone 2, which uses the same engine and is just a little harder to test. This is the built-in benchmark that the game features. And I'm looking at it first at 1080p balanced, because I think a lot of people in this type of game will turn down the resolution and settings in order to get a competitive edge rather than crank the resolution and settings. Here we're seeing the 6800 with a 30% lead over the RTX 3070, although both of them are doing very well at these settings, the 3070 averaging around 150, but the 6800 up close to 200 FPS average for the benchmark run. Now, a lot of people would still play this game at 1440p, and at 1440p, I thought it would also be interesting to look at the balance settings, where I think more people would play, but also look at the extreme settings in case you're just like, yeah, I'm more of a, I'll play the game, but if I'm getting a good enough frame rate, I want it to look as nice as possible. So at the balance settings, we're seeing the 6800 with a 33% lead, and at the extreme settings, we're seeing it with a 32% lead, so we're not seeing a change to, the advantage for the 6800 by increasing or decreasing settings, although the overall frame rates definitely change. At the balanced settings, the 3070 is up around 115 FPS versus the 6800 around 155. And at the extreme settings, the 3070 actually has 1% lows dropping into the 40s, and the 6800 1% lows dropping into the upper 50s, but the 6800 with 110 FPS average, so big lead there. I think going down to the balance settings for those 1% lows to be so much higher is definitely worth it if you're playing the game competitively. But now let's look at Plague Tale Requiem. We'll start at 1440p Ultra, where we see the 6800 with only a 7% lead over the 3070. I will mention this is an Nvidia-sponsored title, and I could have enabled ray-traced shadows, but this video is long enough. I already did a ton of ray tracing testing. We're going to focus at RT off for the remainder of the video. Also, I just don't think RT shadows are particularly noticeable or worth it. But anyway, both GPUs can dip below 60 FPS in the more demanding scenes in this game at 1440p Ultra, although they average over 60 FPS in this particular scene that I'm testing. Although now, once you see the player actually has camera control here, this 3070 is only around 51 and the 6800 is around 54 FPS. So definitely noticeable differences here. This is an extremely demanding game that, next-gen consoles like PS5 and Series X are really only running around 1440p 30 FPS. Anyway, Plague Tale Requiem at 1080p Ultra, the 6800's lead drops to only 3%, so basically a tie, although both of them are doing better here. This is a really good-looking game, by the way, one of the best-looking games I've seen, and it's not Unreal Engine. This is a custom in-house engine from Asobo Studios. I think the game looks great. The character work on the faces, I think, is its weakest point, because I think where you can kind of see their more low-budget limitations, but the environments in this game and the lighting look absolutely fantastic. So definitely check this game out for a visual treat if you're interested. But now let's jump into Unreal Engine 4. And here we're seeing at 1440p Ultra a tie. The 3070 has technically a 1% lead, but this is a tie. Also, going through this corridor of death, as I call it during the benchmark run, this is the game's built-in benchmark, both GPUs dip well below 60 FPS, although for much of the rest of the benchmark run and the game itself will be definitely over 60 FPS. But that's why you see such bad 1% lows. This benchmark run's very stuttery. The Callisto Protocol is one of the best looking Unreal Engine 4 games and most recent Unreal Engine 4 games, but it is not necessarily the best optimized Unreal Engine 4 game. So yeah, there's that. So they get a good average at 1440p, but the frame time graphs are all over the place. Looking at 1080p Ultra, the 3070 actually increases to a 5% lead. That's still, my arbitrary distinction of I basically call 5% lead or less a tie, but it is noteworthy to show the 3070 with a lead in a non-ray tracing situation. Also, this game's actually an AMD-sponsored title, go figure, and it's one of the better performing games for Nvidia versus AMD. So it's another reason why I say people when they say like it's AMD-sponsored and Nvidia-sponsored, where it's just like, well, does that really matter that much? Here we're seeing AMD sponsored title where Nvidia is outperforming them. Plague Tale Requiem was Nvidia sponsored and AMD had the lead. Anyway, Atomic Heart is a Unreal Engine 4 game as well. At the 1440p atomic settings, both GPUs are averaging in the mid-70s in this fairly demanding opening sequence here. The 6800 with a 3% lead, which again I would call pretty much a tie, so nothing too crazy to write home about here. I do think this game is very well optimized for the visuals that you're getting. Also, this game was advertised as a big ray tracing poster child for years leading up to launch, and then they launched without ray tracing. So anyway, I can't test out any RT here, although it does feature some DLSS upscaling and that kind of stuff. Anyway, if we drop down to the 1080p atomic settings, we see a tie, 100%, 100%. If you look at the 1% lows, the 6800 has a bit of a lead, but not particularly noteworthy, and the averages again are a tie. Now, I think what we're seeing here though is in the Unreal Engine 4 games, we tend to see Nvidia performing better on average than we saw in some of the other games we tested. Also, in Unreal Engine 4 versus Unreal Engine 5, we're seeing some pretty big discrepancies there, where in Unreal Engine 5, AMD seemed to pull further ahead. So I was interested in, let's look at another Unreal Engine 4 game. This one is Returnal, and now in Returnal, we're back to seeing the 6800 with a lead over the 3070, this time with a 12% lead at the 1440p epic settings with no ray tracing enabled. And again, it's Unreal Engine 4. So the engine is not always the whole story on what's going on here. Now, I wonder if what's going on here is maybe smart access memory helping out, because you can see the memory allocation and usage a lot higher on the 6800 versus the 3070. So I wonder if this game is using smart access memory and taking advantage of that. We're seeing a 12% lead at 1440p, dropping down to 1080p epic settings. In Returnal, we're seeing a 13% lead for the 6800. And once again, if you look at the VRAM usage versus allocation, both of them are once again higher on the 6800. So I do have ResizeBAR enabled in my testing, but Nvidia has to whitelist games unless you want to edit it manually and with Nvidia Inspector program, which is a hassle, and most people aren't going to do that. Whereas AMD, you can just toggle smart access memory on or off via their driver software, which is definitely my personal preference. I guess Nvidia is trying to make it be like, you don't have to think about it. If I wanted to buy an RX 6800 today, if I look at PC Part Picker, which surveys a bunch of the major retailers, Amazon, Newegg, those kinds of places, sort prices low to high, I can see that I could buy one for $465, although granted that the next cheapest model jumps up to $485, then we see $490. If I wanted to buy an RTX 3070 from Nvidia, I look, again, using the same conditions, want to buy one today, sort the major retailers low to high. I see $548.49, and I see another one, in other words, $550. They're $550 for the cheapest models. See another one at $560. They go up a bit from there. So the tables have flipped. The 6800 launched significantly more expensive than a 3070, but now it costs significantly less. If you look at the current prices I could buy these at today, we can see that the RTX 3070 costs about 18% more than the RX 6800, whereas the RX 6800 actually, when you're not using heavy ray tracing, performs significantly better in most games. The worst we saw it do in rasterized performance was basically a tie, and there were more examples of it performing 10 to 15% or more better in many games using rasterized performance. We saw in ray tracing workloads, if it's a light ray tracing workload, like we're seeing with Lumen when it's hardware accelerated in Unreal Engine 5, we actually saw the 6800 still basically tied and maybe even a little bit ahead. And same thing with low ray tracing workloads in games like Cyberpunk. Now, if you go up to a medium ray tracing workload, then we did see the 3070 pull ahead by about the same margin as its price increase, meaning if you priced these off of their middle-of-the-road ray tracing performance, then actually they're about the same price to performance, even going off of ray tracing, although we did see that with heavy ray tracing workloads enabled, the 3070 did pull ahead by a larger margin than its price to performance. But in other words, even if you're buying for ray tracing performance, the performance per dollar of the 3070 isn't actually that much better than the RX 6800. And I think it would be fair to point out that in the current market, you could buy the RX 6800 XT version for about the same price as an RTX 3070. Now, that isn't the review I'm doing in this video, but the RX 6800 XT is another, 15 to 20% faster, depending on the game, than the 6800 non-XT version. So with that in mind, if that's just, that would probably honestly just be another good head-to-head comparison video to do. Other factors to consider, though, are the VRAM. The RX 6800 does have double the VRAM of the RTX 3070, so 16 gigabytes versus 8. Now, in our testing, we didn't see the 8 gigabytes causing any significant issues, although there have been games recently like Hogwarts Legacy where we have seen 8 gigabyte VRAM cards struggle at like 1440p ultra settings. I didn't specifically test the 3070 in that, but I did see my 3060 Ti start to have frame rate dips down into the 30s as it kind of struggled with its VRAM capacity, that sort of a thing. Now, games tend to use more VRAM over time, so this could become more of an issue over time, even when using ray tracing, because using ray tracing also does increase VRAM workload. So something to consider when you're comparing the two GPUs as well. However, you should also consider advantages that Nvidia does have over AMD. There is a reason why they command a price premium, but you need to decide if those are reasons why you would pay that much more. Because again, you're paying 18% more here for less performance or similar ray tracing performance in light ray tracing workloads, and better ray tracing performance in medium. Now, so we've established that, you do get that better ray tracing performance in the heavier ray tracing workloads. What other reasons are there to buy Nvidia for the price premium? I do think DLSS looks better than FSR2. It's not a massive difference at 1440p at lower resolutions or at the more aggressive settings. I tend to keep them at the quality setting, but if you go down to like the performance settings, I think the image quality edge for DLSS is more noticeable. So that's definitely something to consider. Another thing to consider is what are you doing with your graphics card? If you're just playing games, that's what I reviewed in this video. If you are doing productivity workloads, there are certain applications that are just programmed with NVIDIA hardware acceleration in mind and less so with AMD hardware acceleration in mind. So, but that's going to depend on your workflow. So as a professional, you need to look into what applications you use and their support on AMD versus NVIDIA, because some of them work as good or better on AMD. But I think if you were going to just throw all of the productivity apps out there on a dartboard, throw a dart at it, and wonder, does it run better on AMD or NVIDIA? I think you're more likely to run into ones that have better support on NVIDIA than AMD, because if you're somebody designing those apps, you are going to design them for the card that has the larger market share. And NVIDIA does have a much larger market share than AMD. So there's more people out there with NVIDIA, so you're going to spend more of your time optimizing for their architecture. So that is something to consider. There's always the debate on AMD drivers, and as a single reviewer, I can't give a meaningful statistical analysis of AMD driver issues versus Nvidia driver issues. And that's really the problem also when you go by comment sections, things like that, because everyone has their own anecdotal evidence of, I have no issues with AMD drivers, or I had nothing but issues with AMD drivers, or I have issues with both Nvidia and AMD drivers. Each of those people is reporting on their own, or maybe their small friend group, sample size out of the entire graphics card market. And to my knowledge, there is no data set available publicly that would give us a way to actually answer these questions in a factual manner. So feel free to argue about drivers all day in the comment section. All I can report on is AMD is definitely offering significantly more VRAM and rasterized performance with the 6800, and it's doing it for significantly less money. And if I was going to buy one of these two GPUs, I would buy the RX 6800. If I wanted to go the Nvidia route, I feel like, and I was buying in this price point, I would either just spend less money and get a 3060 Ti, which I think offers significantly better price to performance than the RTX 3070 in the current market, or I would buy in the used market. I would look for used 3080s in this price range, see if I could get one of those. Or like I said, if I was going to spend $550, now you actually have to compare against the 6800 XT version, where the performance numbers are even more AMD sided, and the ray tracing lead is even smaller for Nvidia because you're coming from a higher baseline performance with the 6800 XT. Anyway, what do you guys think? Let me know in the comments section. What other videos would you like to see a 2023 revisit for? I just did an updated 6800 XT versus 3080 video a month or so ago. More recently, I did 3060 Ti versus 6700 XT. I've also looked at GPUs in the $350 price point and in the $250 price point, again, all updated with recent benchmarks. I hope all of you have an excellent day.